Right, but the problem is it's not because of the Israeli people, it's because of the American veto and because of American power that Israel gets to carry on the way it does. Were it not for the American veto and were it not for the fact that the United States blocks any kind of international action when it comes to Israel.
So those things that you would criticize about Israel, like, for example, settlements, you're saying is it President Obama's fault?
Well, is it President Obama's fault? I would say in the case of the Israel lobby, in the case of the Israel-Palestine conflict, I do think it's basically the lobby. If you were to ask me if tomorrow Benjamin Netanyahu were to announce we're no longer building settlements in the occupied territories, where he'd make that announcement.
And he's made the announcement of a freeze.
Yeah, a freeze. If he were to make that, would Obama be unhappy? Of course he would be happy. He would be thrilled at that announcement.
Exactly.
So if Obama goes along with it when they build settlements, it must be because of the lobby. That's just common sense.
So your argument is that despite Obama saying from the word go and being absolutely clear that Israel should stop all settlement growth...
Well, he hasn't done that.
But he has, ever since...
No, he's consistently backed down. Every time the lobby has gone into action, he's consistently backed down.
What he has made clear so publicly the American position on
That's exactly what you're saying is exactly correct. He's repeatedly stated that he doesn't support the actions, and then the pressure is applied by the lobby, and he's repeatedly backed down.
Obviously, down from what, then?
Well,
what are you saying he's backed down? Are you saying him privately to the Israeli Prime Minister, he's saying it's all right?
Look, obviously the President of the United States has the power to tell Israel, you're going to have to stop building settlements in the occupied territories, because if you don't stop, we're just not going to exercise our veto in the Security Council. He can tell them that, obviously. He's the President of the United States. If he doesn't tell them that, it must be because of the lobby.
Okay, so if what you're saying is true, and we then have a diaspora that doesn't care so much about Israel, how's that going to change things, are you suggesting?
Well, it depends. If that diaspora gets behind a reasonable settlement of the conflict, and obviously a reasonable settlement of the conflict would have to include not just the freezing of settlements, but the dismantlement of the settlements. If they get behind that, that would put new kinds of pressure on the president in the opposite direction, and that would be a positive development. Now, that's a big if. I agree with you. I'll anticipate your question. It's a big if, because most American Jews, like most ethnic groups, they prefer not to air the dirty laundry in public. But if you can win them over to a reasonable settlement of the conflict, I think it would actually improve significantly the prospects for achieving a just and lasting settlement.
And this is your dream scenario. I mean, you've got a problem, though, because here you are saying this, and you have a history. You have a history where, I mean, ever since you wrote about the Holocaust industry, you said that there's a fixation on the Holocaust that has exacerbated insecurity of American Jews, causing group paranoia. It's a lucrative and tendentious industry that propagandizes and it seems that lurking in the heart of even the gentlest of Gentiles is a homicidal anti-Semite. And so even where Jews feel safe, they still face imminent danger. Now, you have faced huge amount of criticism for what you've said in that book. You were labelled a Holocaust denier. I mean, your own parents, who were in the Warsaw Ghetto or in concentration camps, you went too far, in a sense, and you consistently go too far. And people say that as a result, your style has meant that it's self-defeating. Your argument isn't heard.
Well, actually, I think it's just the reverse. Most of what I said in the Holocaust industry, which came out already 10 years ago, it's not even considered controversial anymore. Quite the contrary, the one who's gone too far is the Israelis, is Mr. Netanyahu. This past couple of weeks, you saw it in the news. He kept talking about Auschwitz, kept talking about Auschwitz, kept talking about Auschwitz. Finally, even the Israelis said, Mr. Netanyahu, stop talking about Auschwitz.
When you made the
Even
argument,
Elie Wiesel said, Mr. Netanyahu, don't compare Iran to Auschwitz.
But even when
so
you
they've
made
gone
the
too far,
10
not me.
years ago, there were people who said, actually what you're saying isn't new, and there are plenty of people who make exactly that case. Peter Novick's book about the Holocaust. But there's something about the way they, and for example, Peter Novick, made the case that was more powerful. because they had an understanding, a sensitivity that was absent in your book, and that as a result your book came across as a rant. And that's the suggestion about a lot of the arguments that you make. And that as a result we have the likes of Jonathan Friedland accusing you of doing the anti-Semites' work for them, and because you see Jews as either villains or victims, he says, I fear that takes him closer to the people who created the Holocaust than to those who suffered in it.
Well, Mr. Friedland is, of course, entitled to his judgment, but then we can also quote the judgment of the world's leading authority in the Nazi Holocaust by a wide margin, and that's Raoul Hilberg, the author of the classic the Destruction of the European Jews, the 3-volume work. Now, Raoul Hilberg, he praised my book. He actually called it, since you said I go too far, he called, I'm quoting him now, he said my findings were conservative. He said he went through the same record as I did, and in fact, I understate the case in my book. So between Jonathan Friedland, who's a modestly talented columnist, and Raoul Hilberg, who's the world's leading authority in the Nazi Holocaust, I think the judgment of Hilberg is higher.
I could quote so many other people to you who have been very critical and are known as experts in the Holocaust.
No, I wouldn't say nobody is in the same rank as Mr. Hilberg.
But the point is that it's your style, and that your style ends up being self-defeating. And the argument, for example, that you feed the anti-Semites, do you ever have any qualms that actually you are doing, that you could be doing their work for them?
Yeah, there is a problem there, and one has to be honest about those things. There is a problem that you can end up being useful to people who you don't particularly like. Everybody has those sorts of problems when they're trying to deal with controversial subjects, that you don't want to give fodder to your enemy. And then you have to make, decisions. You have to think through what you're saying, and you have to carry on responsibly.
Do you ever hold back?
Excuse me?
Do you ever hold back? Do you ever self-censor?
Yeah, the Holocaust industry is now an old book for me. As I said, it's 10 years ago. But when I wrote the book, I can say to you metaphorically, my parents had already passed away, but metaphorically, my parents were right behind me. They were looking at me over my shoulders, and they were looking at every word.
Okay, but I ask you, so you make the point that's 10 years ago, and I appreciate that, but it's only recently you said of Israel, it's a crazy country, it's like a junkie. Every few years they go to war, they need their fix, they're lunatics. American Jews don't want to defend that.
Yeah, Israel is carrying on in a lunatic fashion. I would like to ask you...
And Hezbollah, who you went to meet?
I would like to ask you, name me another country in the world. 2003, Israel was the cheerleaders for the war in Iraq. 2006, it went into war in Lebanon. 2008, 2009, it attacked Gaza. Now it talks about attacking Iran. If you read the Israeli papers every day, they talk about, should we attack Gaza? Should we attack Lebanon? Should we attack Syria? Name me another country in the world that falls into that category.
Well,
that's a lunatic state.
Israel would point to a number of its neighbors and say exactly the same thing.
No, you show me how many countries has Iran planned to attack? No, let's ask a simple question. How many countries in the last 10 years has Iran attacked?
When you look...
No, that's a fair question. How many countries in the last 10 years has Iran attacked?
When you look at the history of Israel, do you not have some sympathy or understanding, people would ask, as to why they feel threatened and why
we're not talking about why they feel threatened. We're talking about a country that every 2 or 3 years goes to war. And if you follow the press as I do, every day they talk about, let's attack this country, let's attack that country. That's not normal. And when I call it a lunatic state... So why is it that
the Israeli people vote in this government that you say is responsible for that?
I think it's a regrettable fact. I don't say these things with glee. I'm not happy about that fact. As the American economist and Nobel laureate Paul Krugman put it in the New York Times last week, he said it's perfectly obvious Israel's headed towards national suicide. It's become a crazy state. And he says it's not good for Jews, it's not good for the world where Israel is headed.
And yet it's still seen, of course, as the safe haven, the homeland for the Jews. Well, you have a right to live there, although you're banned. Right. Would you go back?
I think that's a contradiction in terms, but we'll leave that aside.
I know, but you could test it. Would you go there?
Would I go to Israel? I think there's a misunderstanding here. I don't have any particularly hostile feelings towards Israel, nor feelings of love towards the state of Israel. It's just not my thing. My thing is, I want to achieve a just and lasting peace for the Palestinians and for the Israelis.
It's very hard to reconcile that statement about your lack of feelings towards the country with the fact that it's the center of your work for decades.
Well, it's sort of like you have strong feelings about the media. That's your work. And for the past 30 years, that's where I've devoted my energies.
And the question
of
identity.
I have opinion.
I ask you about whether you would go back, go there.
Well, I can't go back. America is my home.
And you made every year you used to go to Israel.
No, every year I used to go.
Do you feel any connection to it as a Jew,
I don't want to put on false pretenses. I'm not going to start, beating my breast. No, I'm an American. I was born in the United States. My parents were from Eastern Europe. There's no connection with Israel. I have some American friends who emigrated to Israel, and I remain in touch with them. We remain friends. But beyond that, I have no more special connection with Israel than I have with any other part of the world. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise.
Thank you for coming on Hard Talk.
Sure, my pleasure.